everyone to the final panel of LadiesCon 2021. In this panel, we will be exploring gender and horror. How does gender identity influence the creation and consumption of all things terrifying? I am going to turn it over to our moderator, Mariana Martin, and she can introduce our panelists and we can get going. So thank you, Mariana. Thanks, everyone.
Release. All right, well, hello and welcome to our panel on horror and gender. My name is Mariana Martin, and I'll be our moderator today. Let's get right down to business and have our very exciting group of panelists introduce themselves, and just for fun, also reveal what their favorite horror title is at this juncture. How about we start with Jenn?
Hello, sorry, that's me. Hi, I'm Jenn St. Onge. I'm a comic artist. Who also just likes spooky stuff. I'm not a goth, I'm just somebody who likes weird, creepy things, so there's a difference. For my favorite, I feel like that's a hard one, so I'm gonna throw two out. I'm gonna say The Ritual and Jennifer's Body. I can talk at length about Jennifer's Body, and maybe I will today.
Yeah. Awesome. Lindsay?
Sure. My name is Lindsay Moore, and I am a writer. My pronouns are she, her, and my favorite horror title. That's really hard. That's really, really hard. I guess I will go with John Carpenter's The Thing, because my husband and I watch it every year at Halloween. So our annual viewing of that is coming up.
That's a good one.
Awesome. And Megan?
Hi, yeah, my name's Molloy Tuten, or Megan, or I go by a lot of different names when I'm working because nobody can spell my name. I am a writer, a voice actor, and an animator, and my pronouns are she, her, and they, them. And my favorite horror title is I think it might be Shadow of the Vampire, but I'm also a big fan of Jennifer's Body and The Blob.
Wonderful. Well, let's kick things off with a little bit of nostalgia. I mean, everyone loves nostalgia. What first got you hooked on horror? What were sort of your formative early moments getting sucked into the genre?
Are we going in the same order each time?
You can, or if you just have an intense need to communicate, go for it.
Sure. Okay, I'll start, I guess. I'm ready.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I feel like I was a little bit of a late entrant into the genre because when I was younger, I mean, even now still, but I get so easily stressed out by any sort of tense scene that I'm like, I would be so stressed for an entire movie when nothing was happening. And I'm like, oh my God, you know, something's gonna happen. And I also grew up in an era where everything was Final Destination or Saw, and that wasn't really my jam. So it was actually, I would say it was probably actually when I watched the Silent Hill movie a few years ago now, but I watched it and it was like it still like was kind of scary, but it was probably one of the first like horror media experiences that I really had where I was like, this was scary, but also like fun. And also Silent Hill is such like a good entrant into the genre anyways, especially if you like any sort of creature horror. So, you know, I got hyper fixated on it and spent a day going through the entire Silent Hill Wikipedia and just reading all the information on it. I'm like, cool, okay, now I want some other stuff.
Yeah, I'll go next. So my first foray into horror, I've kind of always been into this stuff that was, I guess, a little bit darker or a little bit weirder, even as a kid, and I was very drawn to like kids horror. Actually, I'm sort of experiencing a little bit of it right now, just watching media with my toddler, because we're watching things like Winnie the Pooh and Sesame Street, and those have like, you know, there's the Heffalumps and Woozle sequence in Winnie the Pooh, which I know scared a lot of kids, but always delighted me. And then my daughter really likes Count Von Count, who is one of my faves as well. it's very cute because she's at the age where she can identify all the characters, but she can't exactly get all their names right. So she'll just point at him and say, ah, 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 in like a teensy little baby voice. It's really funny. But I would say that my first real introduction into horror was probably the Goosebumps books. And I got really, really obsessed with them. I think I was about 10 or 11, and I was just like, I loved them because I could read them very, very quickly. And that felt really impressive to me. Like, here is a book that I could read in one sitting. And so I just kind of started seeking out more and other like similar spooky stuff from there.
Well, I'm sort of in a similar camp as Lindsay. I've always been into like the spooky aesthetics, and I think in a big contrast to Jenn, I firmly self-identify as goth. So you know, like I was a big fan of like anything that was just a bit dark. Like I was obsessed with A Series of Unfortunate Events when I was younger. I was also like really into Goosebumps, but my mum never let me buy the Goosebumps books because the covers would give me nightmares. And I always think so I didn't actually read the books until I was a bit older. And it was like one summer I was staying at my aunt's house while my cousin was away. And my cousin had all of the Goosebumps and Fear Street books, and I read a bunch of them in just like one go. But the thing was, when I was really young, I would look at the covers and the stories that I would come up with in my head for the cover. You know, those beautiful cover illustrations by Tim Jacobus. I would be more afraid of like what I would think of when I would look at the covers of the books, and then I would read the actual book and I'd be like, oh, that's not that bad.
Yeah.
And then I also love like kind of silly, and it's like the podcast that I work on is called Less is More, and we kind of do the more silly horror, and that's a little bit like, you know, Beetlejuice, Count Duckula, Scooby-Doo, Casper the Friendly Ghost, The Addams Family, The Munsters. All of that was a big part of my childhood. So I like the serious horror and the more silly side of it.
Awesome. That's a great place, I think, for us to kind of segue, in fact, to kind of what the pleasures of horror are, because this is a genre that is very associated with excess. Just there's the so muchness of it. And I think it's partly why it can sometimes be sort of a genre that's looked down upon or stigmatized in some way, because there's just this sense of it's too much, it's too much. And I think it's really interesting that a lot of the feminist film theory around horror, especially in the late 70s and the early 80s, was really kind of grouping horror in with kind of pornography and the melodrama, and the idea that this is all kind of causing these intense bodily reactions to watching it, and kind of asking, where is the pleasure from this, from watching this violence, from watching this explicit content, from having it make you cry? And so I kind of want to move now into kind of what the pleasures of this are. I mean, Meg was just talking about both being scared and also the sillier stuff and kind of fun in that. I'd love to see all of you expand a whole bunch on that.
Okay. All right. Well, I feel now like I'm being bossy. I'm like, I'll go first. But, if that's easier. I feel like this is probably very like horror hipster to say, but I feel like between the different subgenres, you're going to have people who engage and consume the media in very different ways. Because, for example, you know, I've been into sort of like witchy media, paranormal media, like ghost stuff. And I feel like that's a very different sort of media a lot of times than if you're watching, for example, if you're really into like the Saw movies and stuff like that. That's going to be a very different experience. And the reason why you like it is probably going to be a bit different. But I mean, I feel like for me, I enjoy horror so much as a genre because it's just like, there's a lot of imagination to it, I guess. You know, it's like kind of an acceptable version of grown-up fantasy, if you want to put it that way, where it's like, you know, ghosts probably aren't real, but maybe they are, you know? There's that little bit of thing of you're like, oh, I don't have to be scared because this is just like for fun. But there's still that little bit of like, but this was very interesting. And I mean, maybe it was a little bit interesting because you think there could be some realness in it. So I just really like that. I love haunting stuff. And I love creature features like John Carpenter stuff, Cronenberg stuff, Silent Hill stuff, because I just really like to take it and pick it up and look at it. I guess almost in that sort of like a Hellraiser kind of energy of being like, to me, horror as a genre is kind of that puzzle box. And I haven't been able to open it yet, which is probably for the best. But I really like just looking at horror and picking it up and moving it around in like this 360 dimension to be like, what is this? What's going on with it? So it's interesting, that's why.
Yeah, I do want to springboard off of that a bit, because what I like about the horror genre is, to me, it feels like you, as a creator, you kind of always have to be on your toes a little bit. Just because like one hip new idea becomes old and cliche really fast. And I would say, like, for example, if you look at when The Sixth Sense came out, and that we had the twist ending where, spoiler for a really old movie, but the spoiler was that Bruce Willis was dead the entire time, and that just blew everybody away, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, what a twist, how original, not like Carnival of Souls at all, oh my god, so so original. But if you were to try that again, I think a lot of people would just be like, well, you're ripping off The Sixth Sense. This isn't original. This is something that's been done before. Like I kind of pointed out, The Sixth Sense isn't even the first film to do that. So what I like about horror is seeing which direction creators take things in, because I think that's interesting, and I think it says a lot about the creator if they're able to take kind of a tried and true concept, something we're all familiar with, like let's say like werewolves, for example, and then if they're able to do something that's really interesting and unique with them, then that's sort of something that like makes me sort of sit up and pay attention and say like, oh wow, I didn't know we could do that with werewolves. I want more of that now.
Yeah, I find horror to be like a very comforting medium for me in a weird way, because like I'm a little bit neurotic, and I think that I like to consume stories where basically it's saying, yeah, it's okay to be afraid of this. It's okay to be like afraid of things, like it's like you said, like that whole like, it's not real, but what if it is? And sometimes it's just comforting to have a movie or a book or where like really horrible things are happening to people, because it I don't know, I find a strange comfort in it to just see like, yeah, well, maybe I would be the final girl,
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like I find it strangely comforting, to see things where there's these horrible worlds where like bad things are happening to people. And I like the way that horror can deal with like sort of the fears of society. Like part of the reason that I really like movies like Jennifer's Body and Raw kind of deal with womanhood in it, like, going from being a teenager to being a woman in really interesting, kind of gross, messed up ways. And, things like you've got like Hereditary is a great like metaphor for sort of generational trauma. And as I said before, one of my favorite horror movies, Shadow of the Vampire, has great like commentary on how sort of auteur directors abuse the people that work for them and are like given a free pass to do that. When that movie was made in the year 2000, so like way before Me Too, it was really ahead of its time. But I like horror because it sort of like addresses the fears of society, and it's a genre that talks about a lot without ever directly saying it, because sometimes I don't like when things sort of directly address things. I don't like didacticism. I don't like feeling like it's an after school special, but horror deals with things in a very like artful and allegorical way. And then sometimes it's just, yeah, you want to see like a werewolf biting somebody's head off.
Well, I was gonna say, kind of piggybacking on that, Megan. This sounds a little funny when you are being like, horror movies and horror content has the potential to be so upsetting or distressing or visceral or whatever you want to say. But I do feel like most horror stuff does go back to real world stuff. Is like, especially as you get more
Absolutely.
fantastical with it. So it's like, it's
Yeah.
almost like you have these things where there's this fantastical terribleness going on in
Yeah.
the story. But it's
Absolutely.
almost like being used to talk about things in real life that are kind of harder to talk about,
Yeah, absolutely.
that hurt more to talk about than to talk about, someone being tortured or someone being blah blah blah.
Yeah.
The thing of like Jennifer's body and
Yeah.
oh my god, ginger snaps. I feel
Yeah.
like those talk about things that are so palpable as as someone growing up and getting their period, as someone growing up and having this immense deep
Yeah.
love for a girl in their life.
Yeah.
That isn't as easy to talk about just as a thing, but in these stories you're like, this is fantasy. I can talk about whatever I want without actually like saying what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it. That's exactly what I mean.
Mm.
And that's why I love horror so much.
Mhm.
I'm hearing here is this really fascinating span. I mean, especially for a genre that has kind of been historically stigmatized in some ways as lesser. I think it's really cool to hear about this span of things that horror is offering, from everything you're saying in terms of the visual focus, in terms of the narrative focus, in terms of the affective focus of things, this identification, cultural and socio-political issues. And so, I mean, certainly what I'm hearing from your experiences is horror offering up this very rich buffet of pleasures that are easy to kind of find your way into. And talking about kind of finding your way into these things, I'm going to shift us a little bit now to ask about the elephant in the room on a panel about horror and gender. And of course, that is the G word, gatekeeping. And I wanted to ask you about kind of your experiences of gatekeeping within the horror community, or maybe the lack thereof. Have you always felt welcome in the horror community? What kind of messaging about your gender have you experienced?
So I've always felt relatively welcome within the horror community. It's when I sort of mention that I like horror to those outside of the horror community that I get the pause.
Yeah.
Especially with my writing. I've had this happen in like a lot of former writers groups where I'll show up with a horror story, or not even a horror story, but just something that has maybe horror elements, something that's really violent. And I'll get a lot of like, you wrote this? You're I've had a lot of guys be like, you're too cute to write this. There was one writers group where this woman was critiquing my work, and this guy just blurts out in the middle. He looks at me, he goes, wait a minute, you're the one who wrote this? And I was just like, yes, my name's on it. Like, what? And he goes, it's just so violent. I thought a man wrote it. And that was meant to be like a compliment. And I'm just there like,
only men understand violence.
Yeah. I'm just kind of like, yes. And do you have anything, like, you didn't, nothing else helpful was said. There was another guy who I was more of an acquaintance of, and he was introducing me to a friend of his at a party. And he was like, man, you will just not believe the crazy demented stuff that this chick writes. Look, I mean, would you expect it? Look how little and cute she is. I'm very petite. You can't tell. I'm only 5 feet tall. And I'm just standing there like, and I said to him, like, you're treating me like a sideshow. You're treating me like a novelty act, or like, a dog walking on its hind legs. And he got really offended and was like, no, that I'm complimenting you. That's a compliment. And so that's the response I've gotten from a lot of people not in the horror community. I've noticed that within the horror community, like I've gone to a lot of horror conventions where I've selling books and comics and things, and I've had guys go and get their girlfriends and be like, oh hey, she's got horror comics written by women, or as one guy described it, babe, she's got girl comics. She's got girl comics. Get my girlfriend, babe. but like, yeah, that was one of my favorite. Babe. She's got girl comics.
It's like I'm there.
Yeah, I know. I was there like, I
Yeah.
got girl comics. What do you,
Yeah.
you know?
Oh my god.
That's been my experience.
The lady at the convention experience of being like, I try to lean into it, especially when people will bring over like young girls or something like that, to be like, yeah, I made all this, but at the same time, I'm like, yeah, I'm not, I didn't just come in and commandeer this vessel containing lots of books. These are all mine. Who do you think did it?
Yeah, I have I agree with Lindsay on the account of like, I find that the horror community is very welcoming. I think it's a pretty like increasingly, I think I'm lucky to sort of like be getting into it in sort of a professional sense at the time I am, because there's so much diversity in horror media now that there wasn't even like 10, hell, even 5 years ago, maybe. I mean, you've got stuff like Get Out winning the best screenplay when, like, not only is it made by a person of color, it's also, horror movies never win at the Oscars for anything.
Yeah.
It's like, but I have had some experiences. I feel like there are a lot of people have a very outdated view of what horror is. And so a lot of people will judge you for liking it because they assume that it's all like the 80s, like tits out slasher movie where it's just completely vapid and like sex shaming and like, the final girl has to be a virgin, and like a lot of people think that the horror genre is still that, or like that it's all sort of like directly post 9/11, Saw, Hostel, just people getting hacked up to bits in like the grossest way possible. They think of like the really popular, like giant trashy subgenres of horror, and they don't I hate this whole thing of like elevated horror of like, oh, I liked this movie, but I don't like horror movies, like, yeah, if you like Hereditary, I'm sorry, you like horror movies. That movie's very, very scary. But the only real experience that I've had of being like gatekept myself from the horror community is once when I was about 19 or 20 years old. I submitted samples of my work to a magazine in Australia called Decay, which is a like horror comic anthology that releases every month, I think. And I submitted my art to them, and they told me that my art style was too cute. Well, I was like, I'm sorry. I just happen to be of the, I'm a person, and I am a person in their late 20s. I absolutely learned how to draw from those Christopher Hart how to draw manga books. I know my art style is very cute. Please let me do horror comics, though. I feel like the cute style would make it scary.
And
Okay,
I personally think that it does. I personally think that the cute style, having something drawn so cutely, like mixing the cute and the grotesque like that, it's like when you see a really cute little kitten and it's got a dead mouse in its mouth.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, especially when you're talking about I feel like if a magazine that is like, going back to elevated horror, that's sort of like them, we're like, oh well, this doesn't look like horror. Too cute for horror. I would like to direct you to Guro as a anime genre. It's fucking cool.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, absolutely. And I love Guro. I love Guro. I think it's rad.
Yeah.
But it's like this magazine was like an old, right? Yeah, this magazine was like an old publication going back to like the 90s. Like, the normal art is that very like old, like EC comics, like Hellboy kind of like really sharp lines artwork. And I think I just didn't gel with the aesthetic.
It's still like, that's still like a shit thing to hear though. You're just like,
it is. It was really disheartening at the time. And I've kind of moved away from comics, and like I do animation of that's sort of my main medium, and I fully lean into the cuteness now. Like I
Yes.
did my last like horror, like straight horror short film that I made was one called Tinsel, based on a short story that I wrote. And I like, because it's Christmas themed, I really like wanted it to look like a sort of Frosty the Snowman style, just like a crappy 2D made for video, like made for VHS holiday special with that very like 60s art style. And I wanted it to be very cute, but while everybody's getting killed by Christmas decorations.
Well, and that can be like disarming as well, because
Yeah.
like it's not uncommon. It's not only delegated to women creating a horror art, but I feel like you're a lot more likely to hear it if you're, coming from a background where you're doing something less like realistic, less blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But I know in my own work, I mean, I'm going to draw what I want. I'm going to draw it how I want, and if that happens to be horror art, that's not mutually exclusive with my normal style of work. And I feel like it's the whole thing to be like, it's kind of disarming if you're not expecting it. That's kind of if it's so predictable that you're like, oh yeah, this looks like horror art, so it's gonna be like awful. I feel like the last year or so I've gotten an opportunity to do a few different like short anthology contributions where I either wrote in collaboration with other people or I did it, wrote it myself, where I'm just like, going along, first couple pages are like, they look like my art in general. And then you get to a part where the party enters into a house and disembowels a rich asshole dude and there's gas everywhere. And then you go back out and it's like, oh, okay. So that kind of stuff. And when you say that there's only one way that the genre is a monolith for comics or art, that's not true, because I want to see stuff that looks like mine and other people doing it.
Well,
So
I mean, it's, what's that that I really love that it's like Through the Woods or Into the Woods or something like that.
Emily Carroll.
Emily Carroll, that's the one. Yeah, she has a really lovely art style.
Yeah.
And I think that those comics are really good.
Yeah, they're gorgeous.
Yeah,
they're absolutely gorgeous, and
see
they've got a great fairy tale vibe to them.
She's doing exactly what I obviously can't speak for her in the first person, but I'm pretty sure that when Emily Carroll is making these comics, she's making them exactly how she wants to make them. And they're great. She has a perfect blend of her regular style and the kind of more like intense stuff, but it all works together really well. And I feel like her name has to kind of come up that we're like, oh, praise. In horror, and she knows what she's fucking doing.
Another thing that I do like about horror, because we briefly mentioned like elevated horror, and to me, what I like about horror is that I feel that elevated horror is kind of in the eye of the beholder sometimes.
Yeah.
Like I recently
people just use that as a term for like, this is horror that I'm allowed to like.
Right. But I recently listened to a podcast where they discussed Friday the 13th, the first Friday the 13th movie, and the way it depicts grief. And so I went and rewatched the movie after listening to the podcast, and I was like, this, you could watch this. There's so many different ways to watch this particular movie. You can look at it as like a portrait of a woman going through this horrific grief of losing her child. Mrs. Voorhees loses her son, who's she's a single mom. He's a special needs kid. And there's a lot of all these different layers that go into this loss for her. So you can look at that movie and say like, it's, fun, it's trashy, it's, just splatter and everywhere. But it's also like this really well done look at a grieving woman. So that's the other thing that I do like when horror is well done like that. There's just so many layers to even what looks like the trashiest movie.
Yeah. You can get sort of like meaning, because like it's impossible to make art that has no meaning to it. So you can, there's value in everything. Even I don't know if any of you watch Dead Meat on YouTube, but they did a podcast episode about the human centipede a couple years back, and they were talking about how it's like how you can read it as like a metaphor for like recovering from like the horrors of World War II. And I was like, yeah, it is kind of.
Well, when
You
you put
could
it
read it like that.
Yeah.
It's just you can take meaning, everything is imbued with meaning.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that's the great thing about consuming art in general. But like, because horror is often so heavily metaphorical, there are so many layers of meaning to so many horror movies. Like, I genuinely hadn't even thought about the fact that, like, I guess I had a little bit, but like with Panel of Voorhees, and like the movie being about like her grief, and that's an interesting angle to take it from.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what we don't know what the filmmaker intended. I
No.
don't 100% think that's what
Yeah.
the filmmaker intended, but it's still just an interesting way to read
Yeah.
her sort of journey
Yeah.
throughout that film.
Also, I realized that we got tangential. Shocking. So I'll try to like loop my answer back to your question. So if you want to ask a different one, we can do that. Sorry, not to be like stop talking. Sorry, gatekeeping. I feel like as like a comic artist and as somebody who just likes to draw horror stuff for fun, I feel like I've had a really good experience. I'll be honest. I feel like I got into it at a time where a lot of my interactions were online, which shockingly, the Twitter circle for horror artists is very wholesome and supportive of each other. So it's like, it's a really nice place to get into. And, maybe just me not reading social cues, but I feel like whenever I talk to anybody in real life, I don't get the cue that maybe I'm being challenged, because I'm like, if anybody were to challenge me on like horror or like, any of the things that I'm very interested in, I'm just going to be like, oh, you want to talk about this? We can talk about this at length.
Yeah.
We're going to have this conversation. So yeah, I feel like it's a good time to be making this as a media and enjoying it, because there's going to be people who are shitty, but it seems like a lot of us and our networks are kind of like standing up for each other and trying to like elevate each other and their work and like visibility, and it's nice because I feel like, I don't know, horror as a genre is better when you're getting it from different people, right? Because it's so personal. So I'm glad for that. I think I'm very lucky.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's interesting to hear kind of the personal things that you're bringing to horror as creators, and how you're taking your own impact on the genre and helping to shape what's to come in it. And I love this whole notion of subversive cuteness and bringing that into play.
I mean, I love like weird cute things. I mean, you can see I've got a clown troll doll and a long Furby up on the window.
Yep. Yeah.
To riff a little bit more on subversion, I'd really, and we are starting to run out of time, but I'd love to hear more from you a little bit about kind of horror narratives that surprised you in some way, maybe by breaking rules or expectations about gender in the genre. And it can be good surprises, it can be bad surprises. I want to leave this question pretty open for you, but I think subversion is a huge part of the genre, and I see all of you taking delight in it, and I'd like to hear more about this from you.
I'm trying to think of like an example that was subversive when it came to gender expectations.
I feel like it
go ahead.
kind of goes back to a lot of the things that we had already mentioned. For me to, so I'm like, I don't want to like beat a dead horse, but at the same time, I think there's reasons that people are drawn to these sorts of stories. Because like we were kind of saying earlier, I feel like there's a lot of horror media for a long time that was exploitative of women's bodies, of people's sexualities, of just like anything that wasn't, straight, white, conservative culture. Am I allowed to say that?
Yes, you are.
So when we start getting anybody involved, like, I don't know, I think back, I guess, to another one of my early horror things that I got into the genre with, which was, Joss Whedon. So, but Cabin in the Woods was a movie that I really enjoyed, and again, from the thing of like, there's a lot of interesting things to think about and details to look at, and but also at the same time, it kind of very bluntly is like, this is like the cliche of it. This is kind of like, these characters don't have to be that. I'd say also maybe like Tucker and Dale versus Evil, which is just a very fun horror movie where you have the blonde like bimbo girl, and I use that word very distantly because, you know, just her being like, oh, she's actually really smart, she's like in university or something. It's like,
Yeah.
but I'm glad that you did it, you know, and someone gets thrown into a wood chipper, so that's always
Yeah. It's always good.
Yeah.
I've really liked the I mean, I just have to say that like while horror has come like a long way in terms of like gender representation, I think in terms of like trans representation, I think there's still a lot to be done, because when you think of trans people in horror, you think of, you know, Dressed to Kill, Psycho, they're always the bad guys.
Silence of the Lambs crops up a lot.
Silence of the Lambs. I think we need a trans final girl. I think we need a more trans protagonists, because I was trying to think of any and I couldn't think of one, and that's really sad. But I like that there are a lot more horror movies now that are coming out that have like older women in the leads. So like you've got Jamie Lee Curtis coming back to play Laurie Strode in the new Halloween movies. You've got I've only seen one Insidious movie, and I think it was like called The Final Key or something like that. And the main character of that was an older woman who goes back to her childhood home. And you know, like things like The Taking of Deborah Logan, I like, you know, because in so many, you know, in most mainstream movies, older actresses don't get to be leading ladies very often. And I like that horror is sort of changing that more.
Yeah. Which definitely goes back to the whole thing of being like, as a genre, treating non-men folk as being like, you know, either they're idiots, they're like a punchline, or like they're there to be sexy. So
Yeah.
Right.
You know, a middle-aged woman. Is she sexy? Like,
yeah. I recently watched Assassination Nation.
Oh, I love that movie. Oh no, that's a movie with a trans
one of the final girls.
I don't know if I would call that horror though. It's a little bit.
It is a little bit. I think
it's got shades of it, but I really like that movie. Yeah,
I liked it a lot. I felt that it had enough shades of horror that if I was to,
it's got sort of the Purge vibes to it.
Yeah, it has strong Purge vibes. So I feel like if I was to put it on like a shelf at like a Blockbuster, that's where I would put it. I'd be like, well, it's going here. But yeah, so I actually liked that because it really dove into social media and how the modern world treats you know, young women, you know, coming into their adulthood, coming into themselves, and how, you know, women are just, I don't know, they can be like, you know, scapegoated and vilified.
Yeah,
as the movie unfolds, that's what happens to our lead female characters.
But
it's one of the, but again, it's got like a really satisfying conclusion where
absolutely,
you know, you grab all the weapons and go after the bad guys.
Mariana, do you want to switch over? Sorry, to if there are any questions. I just wanted to do a check-in. We're at about a 5-minute.
Sure, I am not seeing any questions in my chat at all. So if there are questions I'm not seeing, someone needs to let me know.
Nope. Well, we did one last call for questions, but otherwise you could, if you have a final question of your own, I think we can hit the final question.
All right. Well, to sum up this absolutely fantastic conversation, which is very inspiring, I'd like to ask all of you kind of to go a little bit forward from things Meg has brought up, kind of what do you want to see in the future of horror? Where do you want to see horror going? What kind of projects get you excited in terms of both things you might want to work on yourself as a creator or things you want to see as a fan?
Oh, wow.
Big question.
It's a big question because on the one hand, there's a lot of stuff I want to see, but on the other, I want to be surprised.
Yeah.
I really like that about horror and that it can surprise you. But I do want to see, I think that what I want to see are more narratives and more creators who are not the white cis hetero dude variety. I'd really
Yeah.
like to see more women, more people of color, more trans narratives. That's really what I want to see more of.
Yeah, I feel like I could answer that question from the point of view of like what sort of media I would like to generate more of, time allowing and spirit allowing. I love kind of like younger preteen, high school sort of like girl friendship, girl crush story. If there's witchcraft, if there's paranormal, if there's some like scary or monster or gore elements, that would all be good. So that's me personally, but I definitely agree with Lindsay where I feel like, I can be like, I like these genres of horror or like storytelling, but just thinking of the amount of times over the last several years where I've picked up a movie or a comic or a video game and like, other than being like, it's a scary thing, I didn't pick it up for a specific reason. I'm like, wow, this is amazing. And I didn't know that I was looking for it. So, the more diverse your creator pool becomes, the more stories you're going to get. And, nothing to me is cliche in genre, because if it's cliche, it just means that it has been done a lot by white dudes. And there's a lot of other people who have their own point of view to tackle these stories.
That's
and
very
tell them in
true.
interesting ways. So
I would love to see animated horror come into like the Western mainstream, because I selfishly want work for myself. I want to work on an animated horror movie. Like I want to see something like Perfect Blue get made in Hollywood. I don't know if any of you have seen Perfect Blue.
Yep.
That's a great animated
really
sort of
great.
psychological thriller. And because animation is a genre where you can just go wild with your with your imagination. I also really would love to see like camp come back into horror in a big way. Because I've been seeing reviews of this movie that's come out recently called Malignant and saying like, oh, it's bringing like the 80s cheesiness back in a very good and sincere way without making the movie any less scary. I'd like to see things like that. Stuff like, the stuff that I work on has a very sort of 80s bent to it, because I'm a big fan of like Joe Dante and John Carpenter, and I think I bring a little bit of like 80s camp into my writing. And I want to see more. Absolutely, I want to see more diversity, gender, ability, sex, race, all sorts of. Because whenever I've seen sort of diverse visions in horror, it's always the most interesting stuff. And it's always great to go outside of your comfort zone in terms of things that you watch. But like for like a really weirdly specific one, I'd like to see a horror Western.
Oh yeah.
I think that would be something fun.
Yeah, I think that would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head, like maybe Near Dark would fit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I need to see Near Dark. That's one of my
so
that's
good.
one that's on my list.
It's I
Yeah,
see
and
it
I watched
and then see it and then listen to Fever by Peggy Lee, because you'll never
Nice.
be able to do it the same way again.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what I would like to see, because I was watching I watched a couple of Westerns recently, and they can get pretty brutal.
They really, yeah.
Yeah, like I watched this
whole-
one, it was an Aussie Western called High Ground. And it starts with a whole family getting like gunned down at the side of a river, and it's super violent. And I was like, wow, okay, well, how have there not been more horror Westerns?
I thought you were gonna say The Nightingale. I don't know if that counts as
that's one that I'm a little bit like iffy on seeing, because like I've heard it's like
It's-
really brutal,
Yeah.
but like
Yeah.
in an emotional way, which I
Yeah.
I don't know how I could handle that. Like in terms of like as an Australian myself, I'm
Mhm.
based in the UK right now, but I'm on Aussie. I would also like to make at some point Australian folk horror. I would like to make something that is like a like Wicker Man or Midsummer, but it's set in the outback. I think that could be
Yeah.
really cool.
To be fair, just being in Australia is kind of
Yeah.
a horror. No
I mean,
offense.
we've
lot
got
of-
some of the I'm totally biased, but we do have some of the best horror movies in the world. I mean, The Babadook, The Loved Ones, The Long Weekend, Picnic at Hanging Rock. There's a really good one on Shudder right now called Boar, which is basically Jaws,
Okay.
but if the shark was a giant pig.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I had that. On
That
my
movie's
watch. I'm like, this
fantastic.
looks either really good or really bad.
It's so good. Like I thought it was going to be really cheesy. I saw it. I actually saw it in cinemas when it premiered in Sydney, and it looks like it's going to be really cheesy, and then you like get super invested in it.
Okay,
It's like
I have one
a
more
really
thing
good
I want to see
movie.
more of that I thought of. I
Yeah.
want more creature movies. I always
Oh
want more,
yes,
Yes.
I always want more monster movies.
More
Mm.
I
creatures.
want more blobber things.
And more monster
Yeah.
movies, more werewolves.
I want more practical effects. If we're talking
Yes.
solely about movies, CGI can be really good, but I really want more practical effects.
Yeah,
Yeah, just give us a monster that's all legs and tentacles and beaks and chittering.
Yeah.
And, you know,
Mhm.
we're in a good place.
Yeah.
yeah,
Honestly, that's part of why we watch The Thing every year on Halloween, is because we
Yeah.
love the practical effects of it so
Yeah.
much. So,
Well,
So
on the
same with
stirring
me and The
call-
Blob.
yep. Oh,
I love The Blob so
Such a
much.
great movie. That's a really great one.
Yeah,
Well, on the stirring call for more monsters, I think we are out of time, but more monsters, I think, is
Yeah,
one of the
more
most important
monsters.
messages we can take away from this panel. And thank you all, wonderful panelists, for what has been a truly inspiring conversation. I can't wait to see all of the wonderful things that you create, and it's going to be fun to follow you. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
thank you
Thank
for
you.
having
It was
us.
great
Yeah.
to thank you for having us. It was great to chat.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
I am a horror fan as well, so this is super fun. I appreciate the shout out to Tucker and Dale, which I think is just such a fun, like
Oh,
I
yeah.
love like I like horror genre mixes, so like a horror comedy, horror
Mhm.
western, like I like a mix. So
Yeah.
that was awesome. This is a conversation I think I would love to continue. So hopefully maybe you'll be willing to come to the next LadiesCon and talk about it again.
Absolutely.
Forever and always.